Today I'm going to talk about what taxes do. Taxes do three things. They redistribute, they raise revenue for spending, and they fund the state itself. My contention is that these three functions are emancipatory. Emancipatory meaning freeing, both in the sense of removing limitations and providing power. Taxation empowers the public and becomes controversial when we disagree about who should be included in the polity. Let's start with redistribution. Because taxes are an exaction on private property, taxes result in redistribution. This can be progressive, as in the case of the estate tax, which falls exclusively on the very wealthy, or it can be regressive, as in the case of sales tax on groceries, which makes poor people go hungry. But because taxes are predictable, they actually also alter the pre-distribution of wealth. My favorite example is high top marginal income tax rates. When top income tax rates were 70, 80, even 90%, they reduced the incentive of corporate boards to overpay mediocre CEOs. You can actually see this in the data. When 7 out of every $10 was going to Uncle Sam, corporate boards thought more carefully about whether their CEOs had actually done something to warrant a pay increase. So, taxes redistribute money. And, as we all know, money is power. So when taxes redistribute money, they redistribute power. And when they redistribute power to the less powerful, that is emancipatory taxation. But there's a mistake that's commonly made here. All economic policy alters the distribution of wealth. Do not fall into the trap of treating taxation or welfare spending as the uniquely dangerous intervention in a natural market. All kinds of political decisions change the distribution of wealth. Billions of dollars hang in the balance when the US government decides what's a legal business, like marijuana sales or stock buybacks. What can be owned and how, like a patent or an emissions credit, or which owners deserve protection from the vagaries of the market, like corporate investors or depositors at a failed bank. All economic outcomes are a political product. Remember, the three largest redistributions of wealth in US history, by far, are the defense of chattel slavery, the genocidal expropriation of the native nations, and emancipation. They make tax-based redistribution look pretty puny by comparison. Redistribution is not what makes taxation special. What actually makes taxes special? Revenue. Taxes can be used to pay for, or at least partially offset, the costs of social spending. And social spending can provide freedom from the market. Take the case of Social Security. It provided freedom to poor elderly people. Freedom from having to work until they died, freedom from feeling themselves a burden on their children. But it also made them more politically free, and it made them more likely to vote. Old people were not especially reliable voters before Social Security. But with Social Security, poor senior citizens had the resources, the time, and the incentive to engage in politics. Social Security made citizens. This is emancipatory. Finally, and this often gets neglected, taxes fund the state itself. Government is not just a series of tubes connecting private pockets. It's not a vending machine. Taxes make the public sphere possible. They pay for the spaces with a standard of equal treatment. If I have more money, I can't check out extra library books. I don't get extra space on the sidewalk. Taxes are also where private power is supposed to stop at the door. My boss can't stand behind me in the voting booth, neither can my husband. If I fail my driver's test, I can't slip $20 across the counter and expect a DMV agent to give me my license. Now, our public sphere has never been as strong as it should be. Our schools do not provide equal education. Our courts do not provide equal justice. But taxes are what fund the possibility, and sometimes the practice, of equality. So what do taxes do? They redistribute, they raise revenue for public investments, and they fund the state itself. In other words, taxes redistribute money and therefore power. They raise revenue that provides freedom from the market, and they fund the state itself, which protects the places of equality. That is to say, taxes emancipate. And this is not a metaphor. There are two groups of people in American history who knew that taxation was emancipatory, and they were the people who had every reason to know. The first group is slaveholders. This is Patrick Henry, the Virginia patriot who famously said, "Give me liberty or give me death." He opposed the ratification of the US Constitution, the Constitution we live under today. At the Virginia Ratifying Convention, Henry imagined a picture so horrid, so wretched, so dreadful, that he hated to dwell on it. If Virginia ratified the Constitution, Henry predicted, Congress would be able to impose a grievous and enormous tax on slaves, and thereby compel owners to emancipate their slaves rather than pay the tax. It was too dangerous, Henry and other slaveholders thought, to give taxing power to the federal government, even one elected only by propertied white men, because taxation could lead to abolition. Henry was wrong, of course. The Constitution gave enormous protections to slavery, including multiple limits on the federal taxing power. Those limits are still in place today. If you've ever heard that a wealth tax is unconstitutional, it's because of the clauses slaveholders demanded to prevent abolition by taxation. So slaveholders knew that taxation could be emancipatory. Who else knew? Freedmen. During the radical Reconstruction, the brief experiment with multiracial democracy in the American South after the Civil War, the federal government, for a time, protected the right of black men to vote. In South Carolina, where a majority of the population was black, a majority of the legislature was black too. And in South Carolina and across the South, freedmen wanted two things that would make freedom more than words on paper. One, they wanted land so they could work for themselves and not their former enslavers. Two, they wanted schools for themselves and for their children. But if freedom meant land and freedom meant schools, freedom meant taxes. In the absence of federal land reform, a new property tax was intended to encourage big landholders to sell some of their property. This was redistribution. It also meant revenue to build the public school system. And in many states, this was the first public school system for both black children and white children. Slaveholders had hated taxes so much that they didn't have tax-funded schools for white kids either. We all know how Reconstruction ended, with a campaign of white supremacist violence and terrorism that put former Confederates back in power. What you might not know is that anti-tax rhetoric was critical to the overthrow of Reconstruction. Here's Martin Witherspoon Gary, a Confederate general who famously refused to surrender at Appomattox. Former Confederates like Gary organized themselves as taxpayers. They formed taxpayer leagues and held taxpayer conventions, and they got a resoundingly positive reception in the North only a few years after the war. Northern industrialists were looking at their cities where workers were demanding unions and public investment, and they were thinking, maybe this universal suffrage was a mistake. So when they looked at people like Gary, they did not see unreconstructed Confederates. They saw a poor, beleaguered taxpayer. And when Gary literally planned and executed a campaign of murder to subvert elections in South Carolina, the North let him. Now, why am I telling you this history? Because, to some degree, we are reliving it. The reaction to the first Reconstruction saw sudden attention to the poor, unfortunate taxpayers, a fiscal gloss on a racist cause. That rhetoric returned to our politics with a vengeance ever since the backlash to the successes of the civil rights movement of the 1960s. And it remains with us today. So as we enter what may well be a turbulent period of American history, I think it's important to understand what came before. Anti-tax politics is, and always has been, anti-democratic politics, because taxation empowers the public. Taxation has an emancipatory potential, and its potential has always provoked extraordinary periods of backlash.